I remember the night my mother disappeared like it just happened. The storm outside wasn't the scariest thing that night. It was the silence that followed. When she came back, she wasn't my mother anymore. 9 months later, I was born, and I wish I hadn't been. The village where this story begins wasn't just remote. It was forgotten, a place that the world left behind. The people there clung to old ways, old superstitions, and old fears. They spoke of the forest as though it were alive. The trees whisper secrets, they'd say, and the ground remembers every sin. My mother, Lila, wasn't from the village. She was a young woman running from her past, carrying the scars of a life that had been cruel to her. When she arrived, the villagers avoided her, their eyes filled with suspicion. But she didn't care. She just wanted peace. If only she had known that peace wasn't something the forest would allow. It happened on a night when the wind screamed through the village like a living thing. The storm outside wasn't normal. The lightning struck in strange patterns, as if drawing something in the sky. My mother told me that she woke up to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, she said. But then, it started saying my name. Not just once, but over and over, from all directions. The whispers pulled her toward the forest. No matter how much she resisted, her legs moved on their own. The deeper she went, the darker it became, even though the moon should have been full. Eventually, she reached a clearing, and in the center stood an ancient altar, cracked and covered in moss. Strange runes glowed faintly on its surface. That's when she saw it. A shadow emerged from the trees, but it wasn't just a shadow. It was alive, its form shifting constantly. Faces appeared and disappeared on its surface, each one more grotesque than the last. Limbs stretched and twisted, too long, too thin, like a spider that had been broken and rebuilt incorrectly. It had no eyes, but my mother swore it was looking right at her. It spoke without speaking, she told me. Its voice wasn't in my ears, it was in my head. It told me I had been chosen. Before she could run, it reached out with something that wasn't quite a hand, engulfing her in darkness. She didn't remember anything after that, only that she woke up in her bed the next morning, covered in mud and bruises. The days that followed were worse than the encounter itself. Shadows in the house didn't behave as they should. They stretched and moved, even when there was no light to cast them. Her reflection in the mirror would linger for just a second too long, its eyes not quite matching hers. Villagers who passed by her house would stop and stare, as if they could sense something was wrong. And then came the pregnancy. She hadn't been with anyone. She knew that. But the signs were undeniable. As her belly began to grow, the whispers in the house grew louder. They weren't just calling her name anymore. They were laughing, mocking her, speaking in a language that scraped against her mind like nails on glass. Her pregnancy wasn't like others. The movements inside her weren't gentle kicks. They were sharp, violent, as though whatever was growing inside her was clawing to get out. At night, she would wake up screaming, clutching her stomach as it twisted and contorted in ways that didn't seem possible. Sometimes, she'd hear laughter, high-pitched and unnatural, coming from her belly. Other times, she swore she could see faces pressing against her skin from the inside, mouths open in silent screams. Desperate, my mother went to the village midwife, an old woman named Mara who was known for her knowledge of both medicine and the occult. When Mara examined her, she recoiled in horror. This is no child," Mara whispered. "This is a curse. You've been marked by the forest, by something older than the world itself." My mother begged her for help, but Mara refused. She tried to leave, but that night, she was found dead in her home. Her body was twisted and contorted, her eyes wide open, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. On the wall above her bed, symbols were burned into the wood, symbols my mother had seen on the altar. The night I was born, the entire village felt it. The moon turned blood red, and an unnatural fog rolled in, swallowing the streets. The wind carried whispers and screams, as if the forest itself was alive. My mother's screams could be heard across the village, but no one dared to help her. The birth was a nightmare. She said it felt like her body was being torn apart, not by me, but by something else, something bigger. When I finally came into the world, the room went silent. She looked at me and screamed. I had 6 faces, each one different but equally horrifying. Some were laughing, others crying, and one simply stared with empty eyes. I had one malformed foot, twisted and wrong, and my cries were a symphony of voices, each one more haunting than the last. As soon as I was born, the shadows in the room moved. They weren't cast by light, they were alive. They gathered around me, bowing as if in worship. My mother said that my eyes opened, all 12 of them, and the room filled with a light so bright it burned her skin. The symbols from the altar appeared on the walls, glowing faintly. I knew then, she told me, that you weren't just a child. You were something else, something the world wasn't ready for. Growing up, I wasn't like other children. My cries drove people mad. My laughter killed plants. When I looked at someone too long, they saw things. Visions of their worst fears, their deepest regrets. The village began to die. Crops rotted in the fields, animals fled, and one by one, the villagers either left or went insane. My mother tried to love me, but I could see the cracks forming. She would sit in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers to gods that wouldn't answer. But no matter how scared she was, she never left me. One night, strangers came to the village. They wore dark robes and carried symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. They called themselves the Children of the Black Star, and they said I was their savior, the one who would bring their God into the world. My mother tried to protect me, but the cult was relentless. They performed rituals in the forest, summoning creatures that shouldn't exist. One of them had a face made entirely of mouths, all screaming in unison. Another was nothing but a mass of limbs, crawling and writhing toward us. My mother took me to the altar where it all began, hoping to end it. The cult followed, their chants filling the air. The altar began to glow, and the ground split open, revealing something massive and ancient rising from the depths. You were never meant to live, my mother told me, but I can't let them have you. In a final act of love, she plunged a dagger into the altar, breaking the ritual. The creature screamed, its form dissolving into shadows. The cult was pulled into the void, and the forest went silent. The village didn't recover after the events of that night. The remaining villagers who hadn't fled or gone insane began to disappear one by one. Their homes stood abandoned, with doors swinging open as if something had taken them in the night. The whispers never stopped. They grew louder, filling the air with a sense of dread that crushed anyone who stayed too long. I wandered through the empty streets, my 6 faces turning in unison to follow movements that no one else could see. The shadows were alive now, twisting and writhing along the walls like predators stalking their prey. Some nights, I saw them drag people into the forest. Their screams would echo through the trees before cutting off abruptly. The forest itself began to expand, its roots creeping into the village and claiming the land. Trees grew overnight, their bark twisting into grotesque faces that seemed to watch me wherever I went. The villagers whispered that the forest was feeding off me, growing stronger because of my presence. They weren't wrong. One day, I stood at the edge of the forest, staring into its endless darkness. The whispers were louder there, calling me deeper. Come, they said, find what you are. I stepped inside, and the forest seemed to swallow me whole. In the heart of the forest, I found something waiting for me. A massive tree, its branches twisted like claws, and its roots pulsing as if alive. At its base was a figure, draped in shadows, with no discernible form. It was the same creature that had fathered me. You have fulfilled your purpose, it said, its voice filling the air and my mind. But your journey is not complete. You are my heir, the key to the world's undoing. Together, we will tear the veil between worlds. It reached out, its shadowy hand merging with mine. For the first time, I felt truly whole. My 6 faces began to change, their features growing sharper, more defined. I could feel the power coursing through me, the power to reshape reality itself. When I emerged from the forest, the village was unrecognizable. The buildings were overgrown with black vines, their windows shattered, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The few villagers who remained looked at me with hollow eyes, their minds broken by what they had endured. One woman approached me, her face gaunt and her voice trembling. "You're it," she whispered. "The Harbinger." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She dropped to her knees and began to weep, her tears mixing with the blood that dripped from her eyes. The more time I spent in the village, the more visions came to me. They weren't dreams, they were glimpses of what was to come. I saw the earth splitting open, releasing monstrous creatures that walked on countless legs. I saw cities consumed by darkness, their people screaming as shadows devoured them. In one vision, I stood at the center of it all, my 6 faces laughing in unison as the world crumbled around me. The creature from the forest stood beside me, its form even larger, its presence dominating the sky. Together, we would become gods of a broken world. But something held me back. At night, when the whispers grew quieter, I would hear her voice, my mother's voice. "You're still my child," she would say, her tone filled with sorrow. "This doesn't have to be your path." One night, I saw her. She appeared in my room, her body translucent, her eyes filled with both love and fear. "You are stronger than it," she said. "It doesn't own you." I didn't know if she was real or just a fragment of my broken mind, but her presence shook me. For the first time, I felt something other than darkness. I felt doubt. My doubts were short-lived. The cult, thought to be destroyed, began to reform. They emerged from the forest, their bodies twisted and malformed, as if the void they had been pulled into had reshaped them. They worshipped me, calling me the chosen vessel, and begged me to lead them. "The time is near," their leader rasped, his voice like the grinding of bones. "The world is ready for your ascension." They brought gifts, artifacts carved with the same runes I had seen on the altar, books bound in skin that spoke of rituals to summon the Ancient One fully into this world. My 6 faces smiled, but deep inside, I could still hear my mother's voice, faint but insistent. The final decision wasn't a moment. It was a battle, an agonizing descent into chaos as I stood on the threshold of 2 destinies. To become the harbinger of destruction, or to sever the dark lineage that bound me to the creature. The village, now an eerie wasteland shrouded in black mist, became the stage for this confrontation. A confrontation not just of flesh, but of will, memory, and the boundaries between worlds. The creature from the forest appeared again, larger and more terrifying than before, its form an amalgamation of writhing shadows and faces that shifted with every word it spoke. Each face represented something horrifying. One bled black ichor from empty eye sockets, another had jagged teeth that chattered endlessly, and yet another was my own face, grinning with a malice that chilled me to my core. "You are my child," it said, its voice booming and echoing across dimensions. "Your purpose is carved into the fabric of existence itself. Accept what you are. Lead this world into the darkness it deserves." It stretched out a limb, a twisted amalgamation of claws, tendrils, and bone, beckoning me to take its hand. As it spoke, the ground beneath me split open, revealing an abyss writhing with monstrous shapes. Their forms were too vast, too alien to comprehend. Just looking at them made my 6 faces ache with pain, as if my very being was fracturing. Behind me, the cult began their final ritual. They chanted in unison, their words dripping with an ancient, forbidden power. Symbols carved into their flesh glowed with an unnatural light, and their bodies twisted and contorted as if they were puppets on strings controlled by something far beyond comprehension. The air thickened with a smell of decay, and the sky above us cracked open, revealing something monstrous, a sliver of another dimension. From that crack emerged tendrils of pure darkness, reaching down toward me. The cult screamed in ecstasy, their voices merging into one horrific sound that made the earth tremble. "You are the key," they shouted, their voices layered with something inhuman. "Open the gate. Let the true God emerge." As the tendrils closed in around me, my mother's ghost appeared once more. She wasn't the same as before. Her translucent form now flickered, her face filled with anguish. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the cacophony of the cult and the creature. "Don't listen to it," she begged. "You're stronger than this. You are still my child, no matter what it says. This world doesn't have to burn." But even as she spoke, her form began to disintegrate, pulled toward the abyss by the creature's power. "She is a relic of the past," the creature said with a sneer. "She clings to a dying hope. But you are the future. You are mine." The creature didn't just speak to me, it showed me. It filled my mind with visions of what would happen if I embraced my destiny. Cities reduced to ash as shadowy beasts roamed the earth, devouring everything in their path. Oceans boiling, skies splitting open, and the sun consumed by darkness. I saw myself standing atop a mountain of bones, my 6 faces glowing with unholy light, laughing as the world crumbled beneath me. But then I saw something else, a vision of defiance. A world where the forest shrank back into itself, the whispers silenced, and the shadows banished. In this vision, I was alone, walking through an empty village where no one feared me anymore. My 6 faces were gone, replaced by one. A human face, free from the curse. The creature could sense my hesitation. It roared, its faces contorting into monstrous forms that screamed in fury. The cult grew frantic, their chanting rising to a fever pitch as the rift above us widened, spilling more darkness into the world. Inside me, the whispers became deafening. Each of my 6 faces began arguing, each with a different voice and a different desire. One begged me to surrender to the creature, promising power beyond imagination. Another screamed for me to destroy it all, to end the torment. A third simply laughed, reveling in the chaos. The others wept, cursed, and whispered truths I didn't want to hear. My body felt like it was tearing apart as the shadows within me clawed to escape. My single malformed foot burned, roots spreading from it into the earth, connecting me to the creature and the forest itself. I was the anchor, the bridge between 2 worlds, and the choice was mine to make.